Okay, it looks like we are at 2 o'clock here. So by the time I get done speaking, I'm sure a couple others will have joined. But welcome everybody to the December 17th special meeting of the Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committees. My name is Herb Smart.
Cynthia's list.
And I will be your host. Real quickly, just you see a few reminders there on the screen. Nothing's new to those who've attended our calls thus far. Don't put us on hold. Please go on mute until you wish to speak. There's ample time for public comment on either the items not listed on the agenda at the beginning of the meeting or items listed on the agenda throughout the meeting. We're recording the meeting, and we will have it available on our YouTube channel and our website after, usually by midday Friday after everything renders. And meeting materials are available online on turlockgroundwater.org, namely today the presentation on the baseline scenario is already up there along with the agenda. So with that being said, I'll hand over to Michael or Kevin and let you run your meeting, and I'll pull up the agenda.
Thank you, Herb. Kevin, you want me to go first?
Yes, please.
Well, I'm looking at the list of attendees here. I don't know if we have a quorum on the west side. Although David's just joined us. So we have, if I look around here, we've got Michael Cook from Turlock Irrigation District, Michael Clipper from Turlock Irrigation District, Brody Patterson from County of Merced, Curtis from Hillman County Water District, David Odom from Denair, and Ali Martin from City of Turlock, Debbie Montalbano from Turlock Irrigation District, Josh from Turlock Irrigation District, and that's it. So I count 5 agencies. Am I right? Unless someone wants to correct me. Good, so with that, I won't call the meeting to order. Debbie, were you going to say something? That's why you just unmuted. Because we don't have a necessary 7 members. So Kevin, let me hand it over to you right now and see if you have a quorum.
Yeah, we do have a quorum on the east side. Dennis, you're here, right?
Yes.
And then I see Brody Patterson. So I don't see Walt yet, but we have a quorum now.
Okay. So the first item on the agenda, so we've called to order the East Turlock Subbasin GSA for the purposes of the Brown Act, the West Turlock Subbasin GSA. We don't have enough members to have a quorum, so we can't take any actions at this moment in time. If more people show up, oh, Karen's here.
Yeah, my computer audio just went out, so I'm going to have to call in on the phone.
Okay, so we're at 6. Okay, hi Karen. So we just need one more person for a quorum, so we can't call our our meeting to order. We'll go on to number 4, approval of minutes. Kevin, I'll hand back to you because it looks like with your quorum, you can approve the minutes from October 22nd, November 5th, and November 19th. So over to you, Kevin Kaufman. Did you make it back in yet?
As Dennis here, I will move to approve all 3 sets of minutes.
Okay. There's a second.
Thank you, Dennis.
Yeah, and this is Brody. I can second that.
Thanks, Brody. Sorry, I just switched audio on you. I came on my phone. The computer was messing up. So I'll take the roll call, not a roll call, but everybody in favor of that motion on the east side, signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Anybody against? Hearing none, the 3 minutes are approved.
Okay. So if we get enough members from the west side, we'll go back to our minutes if that's okay with everybody. But right now we'll move on to public participation. This is the time set aside for members of the public to directly address the Technical Advisory Committee on any item of interest to the public that's within the subject matter of the Technical Advisory Committee, and address us on any item on the agenda. You can either speak on those items now or wait until those things come up on the agenda later. We do have two items later. So right now,
Yes.
anybody from the public want to address the Technical Advisory Committee? Sounds like Milt, is that you?
Yes, Michael. Yes,
Go
it
ahead,
is.
Milt.
And I would like to address the advisory committee and all others, Milt Treeweiler. It would be premature to say that we're going into another drought cycle at this time. It's only the 17th of December, and all we know is we haven't had much rain yet. It's always good to plan ahead, and that's what makes us human beings different. We are sentient. We are aware of our surroundings, and we know that science and scientists can help us understand and see into the future. I remember when there were only 15,000 deaths from the COVID-19 virus, and the CDC and the scientists of the Institute of Infectious Diseases said the deaths could go up to 200 to 250,000 if we didn't follow the guidelines. Here we are with 310,000 deaths in the US, and it's still rising because many people don't choose to follow science. In the San Joaquin Valley, 80% of the water is used by agriculture. The scientists tell us we need to use our agriculture water more efficiently. It's important to save this valuable resource because every acre foot of water counts. I want to digress a little now. What has happened in our country? I am 75 years old and I've seen many changes in my lifetime. We have become a society where many times what is right and true is not important. What is just and equitable for all people is not always the goal of our society. We have a society where pursuit of money and material goods is the only goal many people have. Success is not how happy we are, but how much money you have. This saddens me very much, and hopefully our next generation will take us in a new direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Milt. Appreciate your comments there. You're looking good for 75, Milt. I'll just say that. Anybody else want to address the Technical Advisory Committee on an item either on the agenda or not on the agenda? Okay, hearing none, let's move on. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to make sure that that folks on the phone and that the Technical Advisory Committee knew that I was on the line. Amanda Peisch Derby, DWR. So I'm here available to answer questions if you have any. That's all. Thanks.
Wonderful, Amanda. Thanks for calling in. So we'll move on to item number 6, which is the budget, and we'll start with Michael Clipper, Treasurer of the West Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Agency. Over to you, Michael.
Hello, everyone. As of November 30th, the balance for the West Turlock account was $151,369.30. We have a couple of pending payments, straggling payments. I've talked to the respective agencies. So everything's working its way through. For the basin account, for the same time period, November 30th, the ending balance was $1,019,867.56. Any questions?
My only question, Michael, is when is the next cash call? Do you know?
It'll be about 6 months from now.
Okay.
It'll be like July.
Okay.
A little over 6 months.
Right. So I know most of the agencies are doing mid-year budgets right now, so just keep that on your radar.
Yeah.
So hi, this is Debbie. Sorry, Michael.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking of the budget, I did speak with the consultant team about getting a scope of work and a cost estimate for the annual report that will be due in April of 2022, just a few months after the GSP is due. And so that is something we'll have to budget for in this next fiscal year. So I wanted to give everybody a heads up. And I asked Phyllis for an estimate in January so we could have that for you guys for your planning purposes.
Will this be a basin-wide project, or will it be a West Turlock project?
I think it would be a basin-wide project, so it's reporting on the GSP. Yeah. I just wanted to give everybody a heads up. I think I've mentioned it a couple other times, but it was a while ago, and so now that you're starting to look at that, I thought it might be helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. Appreciate that. Okay, overview of the East Turlock Subbasin GSA current and future expenditures. Kevin, is that you?
Thank you. Yes, the East Turlock Subbasin GSA JPA met on December 9th last week. They went through their revenues and budgets. If anybody would like to see those, they're online. And there was no concerns brought up to the board at this time. And the Prop 218 process is continuing, and we expect to have a public hearing at the January meeting, or I think it's a January meeting, and then the actual protest vote will occur in March. So we've included some money in there for the annual reporting, so as well as the 5-year update. So it'd be interesting to see what those numbers look like from the Todd team. So if there's any questions, I'm here to try to answer them.
All right, Kevin, sounds like there's no questions on the East Turlock budget. So with that, we'll move on to item number 7, nutrient management zones and CV salts update. And we'll hand over to Perry Klassen with the Valley Water Collaborative, who will give us an overview of what's going on with that state level program and how we could, as our GSAs, coordinate with him in that effort. Okay, with that, Perry, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, Michael. And you'll need to unshare your screen.
Getting there real quick. Give me a second, Perry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Let's see if I can get mine up. All right. Well, glad to be here today. Thank you, Kevin, for the invitation, and Michael. Are you getting an echo? Maybe that's my end. Okay, so I gave this presentation last week to the Modesto Basin GSA as well. Just full disclosure, didn't have a lot of questions, but in agreement to proceed at the end with the punchline that I'll get to at the end. I know many of you already from my days with the East San Joaquin Water Coalition. I'm still there. This is kind of a spring off of what we're having to do with the regional board in compliance with the nitrate control program. So many of you have heard of this. It used to be called CV salts, Basin Plan Amendment, and it's still being called CV salts by a lot of people. And before I dive into this, I'm gonna provide this presentation to Kevin and Michael. So I'm trying to keep it at 10 minutes here. So much of this, I'm gonna just hit the really high points, and then you can go back and read the details. So I think because a lot of background information that makes everything make sense at the end. So the nitrate control program became effective January 17th. All the WDR holders in the Central Valley Region 5 received a notice to comply. In the process of developing the Basin Plan Amendment at CV salts, the process identified what I call the worst of the worst groundwater basins in the Central Valley. And lucky me, East San Joaquin encompasses 3 of the 6 highest contaminated basins: Modesto, Turlock, and Chowchilla. And we have quite a few deliverables that are due very soon, and I'll show you a timeline here in a minute. But essentially what a WDR holder's options are is there's 2 pathways. You can do path A, and you can decide as an entity that my contamination is controlled. I can prove that I'm not causing or contributing to nitrate contamination in groundwater, and that any affected residences whose wells are contaminated due to my discharges, I will cover them as an entity. And this fits more for facilities or cities, possibly. Then there's pathway B. That is sort of the catch-all for those of us in irrigated ag, dairies that can't say we can meet the drinking water standard below the root zone. And we came up with this as a, and I'm going to use very many informal terms, but I think are descriptive. It was a horse swap. We swapped this program for getting 35 years to meet the drinking water standards below the root zone in ag and from our discharges from other facilities. It's a hard swallow, but the tools that the regional board, state board have now are cleanup and abatement order, cease and desist order, and we've seen a couple of examples here recently in Tulare Lake and in Salinas of how unpleasant those are. So that's what this came up with. So what we have to do is develop a plan for a management zone. They can't be any larger than a basin, DWR basins. They can be smaller. What we've chosen to do in the Modesto Turlock area is to choose the 2 groundwater basins. Go ahead, was that a question? Okay, so they have to be discrete, hydrologically contiguous, and we can collectively work together to put together the nitrate control program. So our very immediate deadlines are March 8th next year. We need to turn in our preliminary management zone plan and the early action plan. And then in next fall, we have to do the final management plan submittal to the regional board. A very important element is the early action plan. We got a lot of pressure in CV Salts by the activists, disadvantaged community activists, to say, we can't wait until the final plan's adopted for you to get drinking water, safe drinking water out to these impacted communities. So the early action plan has a much tighter deadline. In fact, by next year, a year from now, we are being required to deliver bottled water or some sort of replacement water to those impacted communities. And there's a lot of steps in between, but that's the shorthand version of that. Because we had these 3 zones, management zones in the East San Joaquin, I came up with the idea and got pretty good buy-in to form another organization to manage just the management zones. Because irrigated ag didn't want to take the lead, dairy didn't, cities certainly didn't. So we organized a nonprofit group. We filed for 501c3. That's going to manage the management zone, these 2 management zones, priority 1. Priority 2 management zones are Merced and Madera. And so far we've had Merced express interest in participating in this when their plan is due next year. So we've divided the collaborative into two areas. The upper part of the slide is the business management, hiring consultants, having a board of directors, developing budgets. And then for the implementation phase, we're going to have committees in all of the priority basins that will be localized and help develop the budgets and direct the activities in those particular basins. So again, I'm going to just tell you that our board is made up of agriculture, cities, food processors, wineries. We've got a pretty good representation of the dischargers in that area, in those 2 basins. And then staff is myself. We've hired GEI and Ludorf to do our engineering, and we had our hydrogeology work. And then we have many affiliated organizations that are supporting this effort. So the early action plan, we have started already in trying to reach out to the community. That's very high on the water board's list, is you gotta let the disadvantaged communities know what's going on, the availability of water eventually, and then we've got to figure out how to coordinate with entities within our area so we don't duplicate efforts. Really part of the main reason I'm talking to you all today. So we will be having a well testing program that will be rolling out next summer for those who need their well tested or requested to be tested. And then we've already developed a budget and a funding mechanism that will cover costs through next year, which, by the way, from last August through next year, end of the year, is about a $1.2 million budget. So the community outreach, we're asking people to let us know if they have domestic wells. We have mapped that out. But we also want input. We want to make sure that communities and groups and people that are affected by this have input on the plan as it's being developed. And then another thing that we have to do in these early action plan is pretty much a deep drill on the hydrogeology of the water quality in the area, of just getting any data we can, public and otherwise, to characterize the area. This is our preliminary numbers. We've identified approximately 1,700 domestic wells that with an estimated population of about 48,000 people. And then in the Modesto Basin, about 350 domestic wells and about 7,200 people that rely on those wells for drinking water. So I mentioned this is a preliminary plan. You can see the time frame here. Once we submit it in year 2, at the end of year 2 and early year 3, we expect to have to submit, or we will submit the implementation plan that has both long and short-term goals. And then the area, what we'd like to do, and the reason I'm contacting the GSAs is we want to make sure that, and I'll be a little bit selfish here, that our growers are not paying for things twice. I've heard that ever since we rolled this out a year or so ago. Is, well, give it to the GSAs, let them do it. Why would the coalition, why would ag want to do that? Or dairies and otherwise. And you know, those of us that work with regulators know this is Department of Water Resource Program, GSAs, and we're the regional water boards. These are 2 different regulatory authorities. So it didn't really work to hand it to the GSAs. However, I want to be able to say, and I think you do too, when you get cornered by growers and your growers on this call, I want to be able to say, yes, we know what GSAs are doing. We are not duplicating efforts. We are not spending money where we don't need to, where we can rely on each other's work to fulfill any requirements we have in either program. The other thing I want you to be able to say as a GSA, because it's true, is don't worry about replacement water. GSAs, that's not our job. That is the job of the management zones, and send them in our direction. Same thing on our side. We talk about recharge and those activities, that is going to be the venue or the goal of your organizations. So what I'm hoping is that we can come up with some sort of an MO something, an agreement, some sort of semi-formalized, or at least something that we can point to when the critics come to us and say, oh, you're just talking. No, here's a document that we've all signed that says we're going to collaborate and coordinate in these areas. And here's a whole list of things. I've got a document that I prepared that I'm sending to both Modesto and I can send to you as well, that explains the program background, and then these points are pulled out of it. And what I hope we can do here in the not too distant future is get a subgroup or somebody in your GSA, meet with our group, and we decide what can we put into a memorandum that we can agree on. It's not a big rush, but I think it's something that in 2021, we would really like to see this finalized. One other opportunity, if you will, that I think that I want you to be aware of is the coalitions have a trend monitoring network responsibility. In other words, we've identified 30 wells in East San Joaquin area that we have to monitor forever. I say that not jokingly, but it's trend monitoring. Every year we have to do a data submittal to the regional board. Every 5 years we have to do an assessment. And we created a group called the Central Valley Groundwater Monitoring Collaborative. So we've already got a database set up, a central database. We're going to be using it for the management zone data storage, and it's already paid for, and we're inviting the GSAs to take advantage of that database for storing their data. What our next steps are is to create a portal type access to all of us, irrigated lands, management zones, GSAs, to where they could go in and access any of the data that they would need for their reports over the medium and long term, and have the ability to do queries and other things. So I'm hoping that we can get somebody from your group to explore that further. We have to do it for the irrigated lands. It's going to be there, and we figure we would like to have this available for others that have similar responsibilities in data management. And it's for the collaboration. These are the coalitions that are now signed on to participate in that collaboration. So I think I did it, Kevin, in about 10 minutes. Any questions? Here's all of our website address, contact information. And again, I know many of you, so don't hesitate to call me if you want more information.
Yes, Perry. This is Milt Treeweiler. I do have 3 questions I'd like to discuss with you. I'm not that familiar with this nitrate problem, but today, what are the 3 main nitrate sources in our valley area here? What are the 3 main sources of nitrate for our agricultural areas?
Well, excess nitrogen that converts to nitrate, but the excess beyond crop use, crop application, so irrigated agriculture, the excess manure applied that's not used by the crop, and any leaching of dairy facilities, wastewater treatment plants, some of them have discharges to land that are not meeting the standard. Food processing plants fall lower on the list. The top 3, I would say irrigated ag, dairy, and the top accumulation of industry for 3.
Okay, that's thank you. Number 2 question, are all soils equally susceptible to nitrate problems, or different soil types have different, well, they can absorb more or whatever, I don't know. Is it about the same in all different soil types in our valley, or just some?
Yes, soil type is a function of time. Sandy soils, that excess nitrogen, and again, not nitrogen as a fertilizer, the excess nitrogen not used by a plant is going to move quicker in sandy soils than clay soils. Clay soils, it's just a matter of a lot longer a period of time, but only if there's impermeable layers does nitrate not reach groundwater eventually. And believe me, we argued that with the regional board and we lost because they look on 100-year time frames and say, well, it's not there now, but it's in the Vado zone on the way down. And there's enough research to show that in many soil types that's absolutely the case.
Okay, and my last question, that's a good explanation. Thank you for that explanation. My last question is, are some agricultural crops, or do some agricultural crops produce more nitrates than others? Just looking at the agricultural part of it, not the dairy part of it or the waste treatment part of it.
Well, we're just beginning to learn that and put an actual number on that. And again, it's not nitrogen use, it's excess. If you can apply it and your crop can absorb it, use it all in production, it doesn't matter what you grow. It really is a management function, but we are, as you know, if you're in agriculture, growers have had to report their fertilizer applied now for 3 years in the East San Joaquin area. And we're now getting a handle on which crops are having the most excess nitrogen. I can't name them right now, but it's likely you just look at application rates of most crops, and that gives you an indication of the potential that they may be applying more. But it's more a grower. Good growers of certain crops are not going to leach. Whereas a lousy grower of one that doesn't leach too much is going to cause as much as the others.
Thank you very much, Perry.
Any other questions of Perry? Perry, that was a really nice presentation, and we'll, when you send that to us, we'll make sure we get it posted through to the turlockgroundwater.org website.
Great.
I appreciate that. Any other questions for Perry?
Kevin, this is Valerie Kincaid. I don't have a question. I just kind of wanted to say thanks. And I know that I've talked to Perry before, and I think the suggestion of kind of figuring out where there's overlap and where there's not is going to be helpful, not only for everyone to do their jobs, but also obviously the water quality chapter of our GSP is going to probably have to talk about the work that Perry and his folks are doing and be pretty well informed about it. So hopefully it's kind of the start of a relationship where we understand what they're doing and they understand what we're doing, and we reduce duplicity and kind of make it as efficient as possible. So I certainly appreciate that suggestion and the work that they're doing.
Thanks, Valerie.
Yeah, thanks, Valerie. And one other closing thing, Mike and Kevin, if it's possible, maybe put aside a few minutes in April or May when our plan is in, and I'll give you a quick update of what is encompassed in that, and how much pushback we've gotten from each the activists or the regional board. That way you'll kind of be up to speed. And it really,
yeah, that shouldn't be a problem at all, Perry. That
okay.
time frame. I really appreciate you cooperating and shortening up the presentation today because of our busy agenda. That was very kind of you. And I think the thing to take away, I will mention to the other joint TAC members is, down the road, we're going to need some type of an MOA, as Valerie alluded to here, or an MOU with the collaborative in sharing data and information. I think we have a lot in common, but as Perry mentioned, we want to prevent the overlaps and not duplicate efforts to minimize the cost. But we do need to have some kind of a document that will be beneficial to both of us. So if anybody's going to have an objection to that, you don't have to state it now, but you need to let me or Michael Cook or somebody know that you're going to have an objection. Otherwise, I think we need to proceed to the point where we're putting an MOA draft out there for both parties to consider.
Yeah, and it could even be a phased MOA and just a very preliminary with just a couple of points, and then we build on that over time, just so we can, so we could actually say we do have that agreement between each other.
And the offer of sharing the DMS is fantastic, so that'd be wonderful, and hopefully we could return the favor to the collaborative. So any other questions? Michael, I'll give it back to you.
That's great. Kevin, thank you. You guys will just indulge me a little bit. We've had a couple of people join from the West Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committee. So I have David from Denair, Curtis from Hillmar, Karen from Ceres, Ali Martin from City of Turlock, Brody and Lacey from Merced County, Debbie and others from Turlock Irrigation District, Leah from Houston, and Michelle from Keys. So with that, I'm going to call to order the West Turlock Subbasin GSA Technical Advisory Committee and move to item number 4, which is the approval of minutes. So it's item 4C. I'd like to get approval of the minutes from November 19th, which were circulated earlier this week. So
moved.
That was Curtis who made a motion. Do I get a second? Second by Leah, thank you. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, so with that, the motions from November 19th of the West Turlock Subbasin TAC stand approved. Thank you, everybody, for indulging us on that type at loose end. And with that, we'll go to the main event tonight. Item number 8, baseline scenario. This is a modeling looking at the future. The results of the modeling analysis from Phyllis and her team from Todd Groundwater and Woodard Curran. Over to you, Phyllis.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's nice to hear everyone again, and welcome. We are presenting today a very aggressive schedule, a lot of technical slides, a lot of technical detail. We will be revisiting some of this as we go forward in our process. But, essentially, we have the results of our projected conditions baseline today to be presented by our modeling team of Woodard and Curran. As we have talked before in these TAC meetings, the projected conditions baseline provides us with a look out of the future over 50 years of projected water use and water supply and demand conditions to give us a good baseline and a better understanding of how we target our plan. And this baseline will be compared back to other scenarios as we begin to develop projects and management actions to see how we can improve our baseline conditions going forward. So this really is a starting place for our plan development. And I'm very, very happy and pleased that we have gotten this far on this. So I'm going to turn it over to Ali and Dominic. I would just like to say that we've got a lot to cover today. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'm going to push us along maybe somewhere around the halfway point here. If you have a burning question that you think is a clarification or something that can be handled quickly, then please feel free to interrupt. But if you have something you'd like to discuss or something that is a little bit more, going to take a little bit more time, we would really appreciate hearing about it in the chat and maybe holding that question as we try to get through a lot of material here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ali.
Thank you, Phyllis. This is Ali Tagavi with Woodard & Curran. Pleased to be with you folks again today. Before the meeting, I was actually checking the history of where we're at today, and it was almost about a year ago on December the 13th, I believe, of 2019, that we presented the approach to calibration of this model that we are currently using. And over about 3 months ago, we presented the results of the calibration. And so we've come a long way. And today we're going to be discussing what the baseline conditions look like and what the outlook into the future based on all of the data sets and assumptions and discussions that we've had looks like based on the current modeling platform. Dominic, if you can go to the next slide, please. The discussion today is going to be basically well, our goal is to present you basically the baseline conditions and the results basically. And initially, we're going to go through the water budgets for both the sub-basin level and as well as the GSA level. But also we're going to be looking at the hydraulics of the system and the hydrology of the groundwater and the surface water system, surface water, groundwater conditions and their interaction, groundwater levels and contours. And to the extent possible and time permitting, we're also going to look at some of the groundwater level hydrographs that have been, modeled for the historical condition, but also what the model projects into the future. Go to the next slide, please. So the model that we're using, as we've discussed before, is the model that the Department of Water Resources has put together, the California Central Valley simulation model, the fine grid version, which is pretty fine grid, covers the entire Central Valley, as you can see on the right-hand side. The numbers on the right-hand side shows the subbasins that this model covers. Subbasin, the one on number 11 is Modesto Subbasin, number 12 is the Turlock Subbasin, and number 13 is the Merced, and then Chowchilla all the way to the San Joaquin River subbasins there. And so we have since taking this model over the course of the past year and a half or so and refined the data sets to almost the nth degree between folks on the Todd, the modeling team on Todd's side, what we've brought to the table, as well as David's engineering, our colleagues Brian and others. We've really detailed out the data sets based on all of the information that we've been able to put our hands on to bring all of that into the model. We've met with many of you folks on both the east side and the west side. I've been there in a number of those meetings with you folks on the east side, with Dennis and Kevin and others early on. And then later on, Brian has been getting a lot of information from you folks. We've been incorporating the data and information from the south side on the Merced side to the extent that that it allows us for the subsurface flow conditions as well as the surface water groundwater interaction. Same thing with the Delta Mendota as well as with Modesto folks and also the Eastern San Joaquin. This model covers the refinement of the Central Valley model for the Turlock and Modesto has been going on pretty much on the same schedule a little bit here and there, but for the most part, the model is focused on the Turlock and Modesto Subbasin. And so to that end, I'm pleased to say that we have a calibrated model today. We also have a baseline condition simulation runs that are available that we're going to cover today with you folks for the Turlock Subbasin, and then shortly after also with folks in Modesto Subbasin. And so there is a dynamic interbasin flow conditions that are happening between the Modesto and Turlock that is simulated by the model, and Dominic is going to go through all of those today. Beyond that, anything that's happening on the eastern San Joaquin to the north, Delta Mendota to the west, and also the Merced Subbasin to the south, we've tried to fix that to a condition that resembles a historical condition so that we can focus on the two subbasins dynamically as a whole. Yet, for the purposes of the GSP, we're focusing on each subbasin individually. The schematic to the left shows pretty much almost all of the different components that are in this model from standpoint of the land use, the groundwater system, the surface water system, the operations, and so on. So if you go to the next slide, Dominic, we've gone through basically refining all of these different building blocks of the data sets for the model. From standpoint of the stream geometry and the stream networking, the hydrogeologic conditions, we've verified that. In fact, there has been some refinements that Todd staff depicted, and so that's been incorporated into the model in terms of the soil conditions, and then almost significant amount of refinement in all of the time series data set, be it the land use, the precipitation and the ET and the rainfall and stream flow and so on and so forth. All of those have been incorporated into the model. So this model is basically a comprehensive model that provides us a platform to look at water budgets, meaning both on the land surface processes and the subsurface processes and the stream conditions. It also allows us to be looking at the hydraulics of the system from standpoint of the groundwater hydrology and the changes in groundwater levels and the groundwater storage. It also affords us for looking at the interaction between the surface water system and the stream system and the groundwater system, as well as subsurface flows. So it's a fairly comprehensive model. I know there have been certain perspectives that this model is only good for a water budget. I would like to basically let everyone know that the model is comprehensive. It's more than a water budget tool. It is a hydraulic and hydrologic tool that affords us for water budget, but also hydrology and hydraulics. So to that end, if you go to the next slide, Dominic, it basically, we've gone through a fairly detailed, flow chart of the activities, starting from the precipitation land use all the way to where we're at today with the projected conditions. And Dominic is going to go through and present to you folks the results for water budgets, groundwater levels, stream aquifer interaction for the basin scale, as well as each GSA. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass the baton on to my colleague Dominic, who's been working hard at this, and we would like to stay on time. So both Phyllis and I, we're going to try to do our best to try to stay at the high level. If there are detailed technical questions that needs to be parked, we'll be more than happy to address those offline as opposed to at this meeting here today. And so to that end, Dominic, please. It's your floor.
Awesome. Thank you, Ali. So to follow up with our last conversation we had about a month ago, what we really did during the conversation is we kind of just dove into some of the projected conditions. So we discussed a lot about a lot of the data that went into the model, and we kind of did a cursory, very, very high altitude, very big picture analysis of what's occurring from the state of the groundwater system. And we did go through a set of water budgets looking at the basin as a whole. The goal of a lot of today's conversation is going to be to get a little bit more detail. What we're going to end up doing is we're going to take a look at some of our water budgets as it comes to the two different GSAs, so we can understand kind of where some of the spatial variability and some of the conditions that occur in the baseline. But in addition to that, we're also going to look into some further further things into detail and break down some of our things like subsurface flow, stream aquifer interaction, and some of the groundwater levels that we have that we're simulating over the next 50 years. So to put all that, a little bit of that in perspective, as a quick kind of reminder slash refresher course for anybody who wasn't able to attend our last meeting, this is some of the timeline that we're currently working on with the GSP. And so from a modeling perspective, I know that a lot of the planning work is kind of going on in tandem of this, but if, really focusing in on what I've done over the past many months as far as looking at, as creating a groundwater model, an integrated groundwater model for our subbasin. This is kind of what it is, some of the steps that we've taken. So we initiated this process by looking at a lot of the historical conditions of the subbasin. We worked with a lot of the local agencies to understand and calibrate the model, to really develop the developmental cycle of creating this tool and getting it into a place in which we are confident that the results that we receive out of it are going to be very useful for when we utilize that information moving into the GSP. Today, we're really in the thick of things when it comes to the projected conditions. That's this third box that you see on my screen right now. And really what that is the fact that we've taken a look at what are we projecting to go over the next 50 years when it comes to land use, some of the water use within the basin, how that's going to vary, particularly due to hydrology, both surface and groundwater operations, and really where do we project the subbasin going over the next 50 years. And then this last item, kind of as a quick look at some of our next steps that we're going to be taking over the coming months as we get into 2021, is we're going to be looking at what are our projected conditions that we have today, and then what happens when we start throwing some ideas such as climate change, some as the project and management actions, how are we going to change sustainability. So really, that's going to be kind of in the next step that we'll get into towards the very end of this presentation. So to continue on as far as the kind of the reiteration or making sure that we're all familiar with what is it that we're simulating in the projected conditions baseline. The first thing I want to bring up is to reiterate what is the hydrology that's going into our model. Now the hydrology being an integrated water resources model, this iteration of the IWFM that we're simulating, the Turlock Subbasin, really takes accounts for not only the groundwater system, but really all of our surface operations as well. And the number one driver to the operations and to the sustainability of the groundwater basin is going to be the hydrology, the precipitation, that how much water it is that we have to work with on an annual basis. And so really that's what we can see here is that at its core, there is going to be variability from a year-to-year basis, and that's what you see here in a lot of the blue bars. And really, what we're really wanting to show a lot of the group is when we developed our historical period, we used a chunk of the data that we have available as far as hydrology, and that's going to be in this green bar here. This is the 1991 through 2015 is our historical period, and that period is really where we did a lot of our calibrations, where we're very confident in in the data that we have going into the model, and we're able to calibrate the model utilizing that information. Then kind of bringing us into a little closer into the what we're currently going to be discussing is to take a look at the baseline hydrology. So that's going to be this baseline period here. I have between these these purple brackets here. This is utilizing the 1969 through 2018. It's a 50-year period, which is really driven kind of by from a Sigma perspective. Part of our Sigma requirements is to look at a 50-year planning, and that's our planning horizon that we're going to be writing our GSP. That's going to be really what we're going to be targeting when we say we're going to achieve sustainability. That's the timeline that we're going to be performing this analysis with. Now, the last thing that I wanted to add prior to getting into the rest of the presentation, that maybe is slightly new, is the idea that while we look at these projected conditions, while we look at the baseline period, is that there is going to be fluctuations on an annual basis, right? The idea is that we are planning for a long-term period. We're not planning for any specific year or any specific type of hydrologic condition, whether that is a single year, group of years of droughts or wet years or anything of that effect, but we're really looking at the long-term period. And so what that means as we start looking into these water budgets is that there are going to be periods of There are going to be wet periods there. There are going to be dry periods. And you can kind of see that here, that right now this is showing a trend. So this is the cumulative precipitation we would see over this period. And so we are going to have these, what we're calling some of our wet and our dry cycles, some of these periods that will drive our storage and our groundwater levels to fluctuate over time, whether those be that be in either an upward or downward direction overall. But overall, we would like to look at the kind of what is the average condition over the next 50 years, and really that's what we're targeting for sustainability. It's kind of that long-term projection. So then really quick, going into some of the other assumptions, just as a quick reminder, we went over this in detail. So if anybody wasn't able to attend the previous meeting, those are available on the website, believe both in the recorded presentation form as well as a PDF of the slides, if you like, kind of like the Cliff Notes version. But effectively what we went over in that presentation was the information that you see here. So a lot of the big bullet items we hit is, again, we're using a 50-year hydrology. That's 1969 through 2018. For the sake of land use, which is really what drives the vast majority of our agricultural demand, what we're doing is we're holding our 2015 land use and cropping patterns constant, and that's primarily going to be driven by just due to the uncertainty of where the markets are going to be going and where that, and not knowing where or how much any potential agricultural expansion will be within the subbasin. In addition to that, from a purely demand perspective, based on that land use, we're really anticipating that a lot of kind of the modern irrigation practices, we're utilizing a lot of the consumptive use factors that we've seen over the historical period, particularly some of the most recent scenes that we see in the historical period, with a lot of the conversion from flood application of irrigation water to drip and micro spray, the consumptive use factors associated with that. We're going to, since a lot of those systems are now already in place, we're going to we're simulating the model, taking that level of development, and we're going to hold that constant moving forward into the future. In addition to that, when it comes to our surface water supply, so how much water, particularly for agriculture, that we are going to be able to provide to the subbasin, is we worked a lot with Turlock Irrigation District as the primary surface water provider in the subbasin. We worked a lot with them to utilize their TRS model, which is a reservoir operations model that runs Don Pedro and LaGrange Dam. And effectively, we're utilizing that information from the local agency to be able to simulate not only stream flow in the Tuolumne River, but also the surface water availability and some of the interactions with their conveyance system in the aquifer underneath. In addition to that, I don't have it here, but we also worked very closely with Merced Irrigation District, utilizing their MID H2O model, which is a simulation of the Merced River, to be able to capture the irrigation water, the surface water availability to the North Side Canal in the eastern part of our subbasin. Now, obviously, in addition to utilizing surface water, a lot of the agriculture production in the subbasin uses groundwater. Now, to a degree where there is data available, particularly that's going to come from some of our water agencies, those agencies, we are estimating a lot of their groundwater production by historical use, by demand, but really when it comes to our private agriculture groundwater production, it's where a lot of uncertainty lies in this model. And really what we're doing is we're utilizing that irrigation methodology, we're utilizing that land use that we have across the subbasin, and we are utilizing that to estimate what our total groundwater demand is, and then we're allowing the model to pump to be able to meet that demand. So then, stepping away from our agricultural side of things, we're going to take a look at some of our urban demands and the supply associated with that demand. So really what we did is we took a deep dive into the urban water management plans that each of the major municipalities have within the subbasin. And effectively, a urban water management plan is a forecast that on a 5-year interval, each of the municipalities provide that really detail in depth what some of their water operations are going to be, what kind of population growth they're forecasting, really to get an understanding of what their operations are going to be moving into the future. And so each of those urban water management plans project up until about 2040. And so we're utilizing that planning horizon to estimate the per person water use, the population, and the total demand of growth that we see from now in about 2015 to 2020 period up to about 2040. And then at which point we're holding those demands constant for kind of the second half of our baseline. And then in addition to that, all of our municipalities, at least under the current operations, are utilizing groundwater to meet that demand. And so effectively what we're utilizing is the kind of on a per well basis, we are looking at the total volume of demand, the total volume of the historical production that each of the municipalities have, and we're forecasting that out to be able to meet that demand. Now that is also going to be indicative of any private, rural, or domestic water use. Within the basin, we do have a lot of single home wells or small well systems. And really those are going to be similar to our private agricultural wells. Those are going to be really designed to meet the demands of the system based on kind of the spatial location of each of those wells. Okay, so I know that's a lot of information, and it was really meant to condense the entire meeting, entire hour-and-a-half presentation from our last meeting into a quick slide. So again, if there's any information that either you missed or you'd like to revisit, that information is available on our website. So then diving into the water budgets, which is really the bulk of what we're here today to discuss. The first one that I'd like to take a look at is the land and water use budget. Now this is really targeted at how much water do we have, what is the demand, and how do we meet that demand, right? It's how are we using the water that's available in the basin. So I went over this slide in our previous meeting. This is on a sub-basin scale. What this shows is that in general, there's a total agricultural demand of somewhere about 750 to 800,000 acre feet a year. Now that on a sub-basin scale, that demand is being met by both surface water and groundwater production. And the surface water meets a little over 2/3 of that demand, but with that, there's still a great deal of groundwater production within the sub-basin. And the one thing for anybody else who hasn't met or who wasn't able to attend the last meeting, and as a reminder otherwise, is that I have to take a step back, what I have here on these, for each of these slides, is that you're going to be taking a look at both the historical and the baseline conditions. And so really the first third of each of these slides that we're going to go over today, the first third is the historical period. That is ranging from the 25-year period ranging from 1991 to 2015. A lot of the new information is when we talk about the projected conditions baseline. This is a 50-year period that we're utilizing that hydrology that I spoke to earlier, but it's that 50-year simulation. So really the second 2/3 of each slide deck is going to be based on the baseline simulation. So what we can see here is that in the historical periods, we see some growth in our agricultural demand over time, and that for the most part is held constant fairly consistently over the projected conditions baseline. Now there is some refinements to that irrigation efficiency or that consumptive use factor that I spoke to, but in addition to that, really for the most part, what we're seeing is a very consistent very consistent agricultural demand and supply comparatively from between our historical and our baseline. So taking our first, almost skipped a slide. The next item we also have is when it comes to what is our urban demand. And this is really going to be heavily driven by our population growth. And so we can see here in the historical period, we have a mix of population growth fighting with a lot of the urban conservation efforts that we've had. And so effectively you can see that balance, that in some years that we are, the population is driving that demand to be increased, and a lot of our conservation efforts are being decreased over time, particularly in the past 10 to 15 years. Now, when we get into the baseline, almost all of our urban water management plans are estimating a fairly consistent per person water use. And so a lot of the growth that we're going to be seeing when it comes to our urban expansion, especially our urban growth of demand and the pumping associated that, is really going to be heavily driven by the expansion of population. And that's really what you're seeing here in this growth pattern. And again, that's based off of the urban water management plans. So then now getting into some new ground, into getting into information that is new to this presentation. The first slide we want to take a look at is what are some of the water use across the basin, but within each GSA. And so throughout this, from both this slide and throughout the remainder of the presentation, you'll notice that we'll look at the subbasin as a whole, and then I'll break everything down into what we consider the West Turlock Subbasin GSA and then the East Turlock Subbasin GSA. And so first taking a look in the west side of our subbasin, you can see that our water use is predominantly surface water based. TID does have access to a reservoir system, and that reservoir system, that conveyance network, allows them to supply surface water to the vast majority of its customers. And that's what you're seeing here, is that in general that surface water demands are fairly well met with that surface water supply. Now, there is a significant amount of groundwater production, and the caveat to this slide that I'd like to include is that what you're seeing here in this gray bar, the gray bars at the bottom, is agricultural production, but more specifically is that it is private agricultural production. And now this is going to differ from when we get into the groundwater budgets here in a minute, because this is a water use budget. And so the variance between the two of those is the fact that any agency pumping, particularly by Turlock Irrigation District, is included in the delivery category in this case. And the reason for that is because the vast majority of the pumping that is occurring that is being produced by the district is not directly applied to a field. It is put into the canal system, to the conveyance network, and then is delivered in potentially a different spatial location from where it's pumped. So because of that, this data, since it's a water use budget and is really based on the farm gate deliveries of the basin, these deliveries will include some production by the agency itself. I will get into, in a couple slides, I'll get into what to incorporate, so we can look at both the total pumping that is occurring by the GSA, but I just wanted to add that caveat to this in case anybody was curious how agency groundwater production was handled. So then taking a look at, again, looking at the urban water use, particularly on the west side of the basin, is we can take a look at this and see that the vast majority of the urban groundwater production in the basin is going to occur in our western half, in the western GSA. And that is going to be because that is just effectively what's where a lot of our population is residing. And so the western Turlock GSA includes all the municipalities that are within the subbasin, as well as a good degree of those private domestic homeowners in those as well. So then when it comes to the East Turlock Subbasin GSA, kind of the eastern half of our subbasin, is we can see almost a flip of that trend, and comparatively to the West. And so really what you can see here is that we have agricultural demand, again, in the negative. That's really what is driving our water use. And in the positive direction, we have our groundwater production and surface water deliveries. And our surface water deliveries in this case are going to be predominantly based around Merced Irrigation District, their deliveries to the north, off of the North Side Canal, as well as some riparian diverters off of the Merced River that we're accounting for. So we can see that in contrast to the western side of our subbasin, the east side is predominantly a groundwater producing zone, in which the vast majority of the agricultural demand in the east is going to be very much groundwater driven. Similarly to effectively to the west, when it comes to our looking at the east side of the subbasin, and looking at what is our urban demand over time, you can kind of really see a couple things with this chart. Is one, it's much smaller comparatively to the west. We're looking at, in general, between 1,000 and 2,000 acre feet cumulative of the entire GSA. And because of that, we are, this is really going to be focused in on some of the rural residential areas that are particularly in the kind of the further eastern sections of our subbasin. Now, this data is heavily based on what is the California Water Plan, as developed by Department of Water Resources, and this is that the eastern GSA is for the most part aligns with the demand unit area that is independent and that is representative in the water plan. And so, due to the kind of the uncertainties associated with understanding how much water, or how much water each of the individuals who live on kind of private homesteads, that data is really not available for de minimis users, is that we're really utilizing kind of the state level resources to estimate what that volume of water is. Okay, so now that we've taken a look at really how the water is used within our subbasin, the next step is to take a look at our operational water budgets. And the operational water budgets are really a combination of kind of the vertical interaction with our subbasin. These are the things that we have really direct interaction. They're going to be things like groundwater production. They're going to be like direct canal and reservoir recharge. and as well as any kind of precipitation, the percolation of both of precipitation and of that applied water that we have on each of these lands, as well as the kind of the general operations on that kind of that vertical scale. On the other hand, we definitely acknowledge that our operations greatly affect the subbasin. That if else we wouldn't be developing a GSP. It wouldn't be, we wouldn't have the problem of achieving sustainability. But on the other hand, so we are certainly interacting with the kind of the natural system, right? We're interacting with the subbasins around us, as well as with the rivers that are on our three major, all three sides of our subbasin. We'll get into those in a minute, but for right now, we're looking at kind of a straight verticality of what is occurring, kind of basically what is the interaction with those land and water use budgets that I showed a minute ago. And really the goal of looking at these operational budgets is to get an idea, is to assess whether the subbasin as a whole, and then particularly each GSA, whether they're effectively an extractor or a contributor to our aquifer system. And that way we can help really targeting our projects and management actions as we shoot to achieve sustainability. So the first of these to take a look at is really what happens at a subbasin level. And so as I mentioned in the previous slide, we're really looking at three main categories. We're looking at groundwater production in this gray color. We're looking at deep percolation, both from precipitation and from applied water in the green. And then we have what we're considering canal and reservoir recharge. This is effectively all the losses associated with the conveyance networks for the water delivery systems within the subbasin. Excuse me. And really what you can see from this is that for the most part that we're gonna have a little bit of all of those throughout the subbasin, but it's really the balance of those that really is gonna be up to drive our sustainability in the long term. And so what we can see in the figure to the right is, as we take a look at both our historical and our baseline simulation, is that our historically we were a net extractor, particularly as we look at over the whole historical 25-year period, particularly over in the drought and some of those drier periods, and as development really kind of reached its most modern peak, is that we really become pretty heavily a historical a net extractor from the aquifer system, and that the volume of this on that 25-year period is about 45,000 acre-feet a year. Now, since we're holding a lot of that land development constant, but we're applying that over a 50-year hydrology, we're going to see some ups and downs based on the hydrology and availability of water. On the other hand, since we are as a
Dominic, could I break in just for a second?
Of course, please do so.
I believe you just stated the drawdown is 45,000 acre-feet per year, and the drawdown we've concluded is 65,000 acre-feet per year. So where did you come up with the 45,000 acre-foot drawdown? I'll get off.
Yeah, of course, and thank you for pointing that out. So based on kind of what I spoke to a moment ago about this being just entirely a vertical interaction. So this is only looking at both our extractions and a deep percolation is 45,000 acre-feet a year. Now, the difference between the 45,000 acre-feet a year and the 60,000 acre-feet a year, which we consider our total overdraft, is what's occurring with all the other hydrological features within the subbasin. So is that our overdraft is not entirely indicative of just how much groundwater we pump and then we deep percolate. It's really the interaction of our water levels with the stream interactions with our subsurface flows to our adjoining basins. It's really the overall look at the storage rather than this straight component. So this is only a small fraction of our water budget. I shouldn't say small, it's a significant part of our water budget, but it is a fraction of our water budget. And that's going to be part of one of the goals today is I hope to take this as the first part of this analysis, and then I will add in kind of effectively what we consider some of the more natural interactions or the hydrological interactions that we have, and we can build up to a full groundwater budget, which we'll be discussing, and of that number we're in the mid 60,000 as far as overdraft, and that's our change in storage. Does that answer your question? Okay. I'll go on, but if it is unclear, please feel free to interrupt me again.
I think, Dominic, if we can keep going once we get to the groundwater budget charts, and folks would have a chance to see the entirety of the groundwater budget components, it'll become more apparent. But thank you for the question and the response.
Absolutely. So then kind of effectively round out some of this slide. One of the things that we can take a look at is, particularly since we are now at a full build out, very consistent with kind of the most recent operations and land use that we've seen over time, and then forecast that over the 50-year hydrology, is we can see that in general, over the projected conditions, we're actually going to become increase that net extraction from 45 to about 76,000 acre feet a year. So then, taking a breakdown into looking at really where is this a lot of this interaction occurring spatially, the first thing we want to take a look at is what is the interaction with the West Turlock Subbasin GSA. And so really what we can see here is, particularly because of a lot of the surface water being operated in the West, that in general you're going to see a lot more percolation and less groundwater demand per a lot of the agricultural interaction that we're seeing. And so really what we can see overall is that our net interaction on the west side of the subbasin is actually in the other direction. We are a net recharger to the aquifer system, and that is going to be fairly consistent over time, both from a perspective of the fact that the West has been the development in the West has been for a much longer period, as well as that surface water operation being fairly consistent over time. And so we're looking at about 110,000 of a net recharge in the West over the course of the baseline. On the other hand, when it comes to taking a look at the East Turlock Subbasin GSA, what we can see is that in general in the East, we are a net extractor from the aquifer system. And really that is going to be most heavily driven by the fact that the surface water availability is not there to meet our agricultural demand. So in general, we pump a lot of that water to meet our agricultural operations. And so because of that, we extract far more than we percolate. And effectively the balance of that is going to be predominantly evapotranspiration, right? So it's creating our yields throughout our crops. And if we look at that interaction over time, what we can see is that primarily indicative to the agricultural expansion in the East, we are seeing this net extraction increasing over time. And then since we are holding a lot of our land development constant, as we get into our projected conditions, we're seeing the long-term averages comparatively to our historical increasing by about 30,000 acre feet a year. And so we're looking at about 150 to 185,000 acre feet of net extracting from our aquifer system. So then take a look into like the next couple steps as far as what are the other interactions that occur into our baseline, or what are the other kind of components that build into our water budgets. The first one to take a look at today is the stream and aquifer interaction. Now, stream aquifer interaction is another major component of SGMA, and it is one of our potential undesirable results is going to be the depletion, stream surface water depletions. And so in order to take a look at that, we need to look at what is our stream aquifer interaction. Now, the foundation of our analysis as far as how much water is available in the rivers to interact with our groundwater system is going to be the TRS model developed by TID, which simulates both surface water deliveries and the inflow downstream of LaGrange Dam. But in addition to that, to our south, we have the Merced River, and that river is operated by Merced Irrigation District. And so we worked with them to develop a baseline simulation utilizing many of the same input assumptions, criteria, things to that effect, and to get Merced River inflows as well as their surface water deliveries. And so basically it's the two primary rivers that we have direct control over. The foundation of the volume of water that is in those rivers to interact with our system is going to be based off the simulations provided by the two operating districts. So what does that mean as far as our total interaction with the system? So I know there's a lot of information on this slide, and I'll try to go through each of them independently. But what we have here is a breakdown of the stream and groundwater interaction between the three major rivers that make up our boundary. So we have the Tuolumne River to the north, the San Joaquin River to the west, and the Merced River to the south. So first off, the goal to take a look at, particularly let's start with just the historical period in the Tuolumne River. What we can see is that in general, the Tuolumne River, we were a net giver to the stream system. And really what that means is that a lot of our groundwater system, our water levels were high enough such that the water was traveling from our groundwater system into the river. If we look at the net value, we see that overall that is the case, that we were losing water from the stream system to the Tuolumne River. Now that interaction is going to be very spatially dependent, and I'll go over that in a couple slides. But what we can see as we look at this over time is that as water levels decline in the subbasin, we are seeing that interaction, that due to declining groundwater levels, that interaction with the Tuolumne River, we start seeing the volume of water that is leaving the aquifer system and going into the river system, and how effectively what we are losing to the rivers, it starts decreasing over time, and that occurs in the historical period. And what we can see is that the baseline is really a continuation of that. You can see that over our 50-year period, that the relationship between the Tuolumne River, from us being a net giver to the system, starts kind of effectively continues to decrease over time, to the point in which by the end of our baseline simulation, particularly if we go to the far extents and we look at the kind of the last couple of years here, you can see that towards the end of our baseline simulation, we get to a point where we are extracting more water from the Tuolumne River than we ever did in the baseline, or than we actually give back. And so we effectively becoming net extractor from the river system, reducing the downstream flow from the river itself. So then taking a look at the San Joaquin River, we see to a degree, we see a little bit more stable of an interaction, whereas the interaction as far as the volume of water that leaves the subbasin and goes into the San Joaquin River stays fairly constant over time. We can still definitely see that in the long term, that volume of water does decrease. And this is again really interactive with the fact that we are lowering groundwater levels, and it's really the head differential between the water that's in the river system, the water that's in our aquifer system, is that since our aquifer system is being reduced, that interaction is also being reduced. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to the Merced River to the subbasin has always really been a net giver to our stream system. This really means that we have that water in the Merced River is leaving the Merced River system and is entering the aquifer system. And this is a combination of both the Turlock Subbasin and the Merced Subbasin. But very similar to the trends that we're seeing in the other two rivers, the Merced River is seeing a growth of water entering the groundwater system. And so effectively what I mean by that is that particularly, and we had a couple high years here in the early 2000s, the late 90s, is that we were, to a degree, we were fairly balanced. And as we get into the second half of our historical period, we really start becoming a little bit of a net extractor. We start pulling more and more water out of the Merced River, and then because of the declining water levels throughout the historical period and that continuation of over extraction in the subbasin, is that the water levels are again continuing to decline to the point where the Merced River is being a net giver to our aquifer system, and we can see that growth increasing over time. So then take a look at what this means from a spatial perspective. Taking a look at this on the western side, we see a very, very similar trend. But there's going to be some variances, and so particularly some of the things we're wanting to point out is that the vast majority of the Tuolumne River interaction is going to be on the western side of our subbasin. And this is going to be predominantly focused in on the fact around some of our municipalities, and I'll get into the exact location here in a second. But in general, we can see that that on the west, that this trend of water effectively of the subbasin going from losing water from the aquifer system, and then as we move forward in time, being to the point where we pull water out of pulling water out of the river system, that trend is continuing to occur. Obviously, the west being the entirety of the San Joaquin River. The San Joaquin River is going to be indicative of what I went over in the previous slide. And then again, but on the other hand, when it comes to the Merced River, particularly as we get farther down into the confluence near of where the Merced and the San Joaquin River come together, we can see that overall the interaction the majority of the interaction is going to be in the eastern subbasin. I'll get into that the eastern GSA, and I'll get into that into a sec. But we really can see, that even in the west, particularly around that confluence, we were in the historical period being a giver to the stream system, to the point at which we received enough decline in water levels, particularly during this last drought. And as we get into the baseline period, we start becoming again a net extractor when we look at the western half of the subbasin. Now, to take a look at the flip of that, the look in the eastern half of the subbasin, what we can really see here is that the Tuolumne River is the interaction is goes from, again, a net giver to the aquifer system. We're seeing that Tuolumne the river is, that seepage is gaining from the groundwater system, particularly in the historical period. And again, as we get into the baseline, we become a little bit more of a balanced interaction to the point where, but towards the end of it, we start seeing water again being pulled out of the river system. Now, on the other hand, with the Merced River is a primarily disconnected river when it comes, particularly as we start getting into some of the baseline period on the southeast section of our subbasin. But what we can really see before that point of disconnection, though, is that the east side has always been an extractor from the Merced River over time, but it is only going to get to the point where we start pulling even more than the volumes. We moved from about being an extractor of about 30,000 acre-feet a year from the Merced River, and to what we're forecasting in the baseline is about a little over 50,000 acre-feet a year in the eastern side of our subbasin. So then to take a look at really kind of what is the spatial interaction of that. Both this slide and then the following couple of slides, what I'd like to do is I'd like to walk you through some of the time periods that we're simulating in kind of some decadal splits to take a look at what are some of the interactions that we're doing or we're seeing, and how does that trend change spatially. Previous couple slides, we looked at big pictures like the whole reach over time, but really now to take a look at really where is this occurring and trying to understand what is really the effects on a spatial scale. So some quick understanding of effectively what you're looking at in these charts. What you're going to see here is 3 different colors. And this is going to be from the contrary to the previous slide. This is going to be from the perspective of the stream system. And so in the blue color, you're going to see this is where the stream is gaining from the aquifer system. On the other hand, and when we consider gaining is where we consider it predominantly gaining, meaning at least 85% of the time that the volume of water in the river is on a monthly basis is water that is occurring from the groundwater system to the stream system. On the other hand, when it hit this mixed category, this is when it's that both over the time period, or whether it's seasonally, or whether that is over the 10 years of decadal split. This is really a mixed interaction. So we'll see a lot of monthly periods where we are gaining. We'll see a lot of periods where we're losing. And then really what this is indicative of is where that groundwater levels in the stream stage are fairly consistent, but we will see that variability as we take a look at some of the hydrology of the systems, and that variability from year to year, we'll see a lot of that range in motion between there. And on the other hand, on the last factor we have is what we're calling our losing reaches. These are reaches that are consistently, at least 85% of the time, that are consistently water is traveling from the stream system to our aquifer system. So really what we can take a look at, particularly let's say starting on the beginning of our historical simulation. So this is the first decade that we simulated historically. This is 1991 to 2000. What we see for the most part is that the Tuolumne River, the upper reaches of the Tuolumne River were predominantly a gaining reach, meaning our water was moving from the groundwater system to the streams. Then as we move further south, move further west or downstream of that reach, we can see that it really becomes a little bit more mixed. The water levels start reaching about the stage point. We see a lot of variability through there over time. We see a lot of consistency between gaining and mixing as far as taking a look at the San Joaquin River. And then when it comes to the Merced River, as I mentioned earlier, we have predominantly, even in the historical period, the Merced River has been a net contributor to the aquifer system, particularly in the upper reaches of that river. On the other hand, towards the beginning of our simulation, we have the Merced River, once it gets further downstream, about the second half of the reach that is adjacent to our basin, we see that as actually in general, a gaining reach. Now, comparing that to the other slide that I have here, when we take a look at the last decade of our historical simulation, our 2006 to 2015, is what we can start seeing is that as our water levels decline over time, as we look the 15-year split between the two of these, between their central points, is what we can see is as water levels decline over the historical period, we can start seeing this shift. Now, if we focus in on the Tuolumne River now, we can see that our declining water levels have driven the Tuolumne River to be a predominantly gaining reach on the eastern side to still pretty heavily gaining, but it's a little bit more mixed. Lower water levels are indicative of a little bit more consistent back and forth interaction. That's where we're going to see a little bit more of the greens pop up here. And then as we move further, again, due to declining water levels, we start turning from being a consistently mixed to a combination of predominantly mixed with some losing reaches. Now, you'll notice here that this is going to be particularly based around some of the urban areas that are adjacent to the Tuolumne River. There's always been a cone of depression in the city of Modesto, and due to very localized groundwater production from the urban areas, and we can see that being occurred, that cone of depression is interacting with the stream system, and we can see that that due to the lower water levels caused by that cone, that the river system becomes a predominantly losing system in the last 10 years of our historical simulation. Now, as we move into our baseline simulation, what we actually have here is a comparison. So the figure we have to our left now is what was a second ago on your right, but that historical is the 10-year split of the last 10 years of our historical period and the first 10 years of our baseline. So effectively, what we can see here is that as we move into our baseline, we are going to see a continuation of the same trends, right? So in our historical simulation, we see there's effectively a 10-year gap, and the major component, that is the drought period, that the drought caused a great decline in water levels. It's really the driver for a lot of the GSP, is that the decline in water levels has caused interaction, particularly with the Tuolumne River, that has driven a lot of that interaction to particularly a lot of the gaining reaches just continue to become more a little bit more mixed of a system. Now, we still see in the highest reaches of the river, we still see that to be a gaining reach, and and it's not that we're entirely, but this is what I spoke to when we looked at the temporal charts, is the beginning and middle of our baseline we're fairly balanced, right? And that makes sense as we look at this on a mixed. The mixed scale here is that we start seeing that mixed interaction. We're not 85% gaining, we're not 85% losing, but in general, we see that continuation of declining water levels have given us a much more mixed interaction, a much more pseudo-balanced interaction with the stream system over these 10 years. And again, we see the same idea when it comes to the city of Modesto, that cone of depression is still driving a predominantly losing reach here. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to the Merced River, we can see that over time, that due to the decline in water levels, we're seeing the interface point, particularly, which is we're considering kind of effectively where my cursor is the point between where we're going from a losing reach to either a mix, or what was a losing reach to a gaining reach, it becomes a losing reach to a little bit more of a mixed reach. And as water levels decline, as we see water levels being reduced in this area, we can see that the trends that the Merced River become more and more farther downstream, the Merced River system becomes more consistently losing, and that is going to be indicative of really the overproduction within the subbasin. And then if we continue this again and we look at the beginning of our simulation period, so the first 10 years of their simulation period, and then the last 10 years of our simulation period. Now we're comparatively to the historical period, which is a 25 years period. This is now a 50-year period, so it's a much longer time period. But for the sake of time, to really kind of jump to, well, what are we looking at between today and the end of the simulation? We see this exact same trends. Continued decline in water levels means that we have the gaining areas start becoming more and more mixed. A lot of the mixed areas, if we continue to decline our groundwater levels, we continue to extract more water than we recharge. That overall, our mixed areas will start becoming losing reaches. and that is going to occur throughout the subbasin. So that continuation will continue, that trend will continue to occur. The same idea, we start seeing that the cone in the Modesto series area begin, further expand. But in general, the entire subbasin, the water level as it is being reduced, the interaction is becoming, we are pulling more and more water out of the Tuolumne River. In addition to that, for the Merced River to our south, we see the same trends, that the interface point is starting to move further and further downstream, further and further to the west, and is because of our over-extraction and our reducing groundwater levels. And I didn't speak too heavily throughout the previous slides when it comes to the San Joaquin River, and this is really heavily indicative of the fact that we don't see a lot of variability, and I think we discussed that when we went over the temporal trends, some of the bar charts, that overall we do see some shifts in the San Joaquin River being from in the volume of water that is going from the aquifer system to the stream system. But overall, the component of the San Joaquin River being a predominantly gaining river is going to continue, whether that is in the historical period or throughout the baseline.
Dominic, I have a quick question.
Of course.
Regarding the two rivers and the difference in the two rivers, is the Merced extracting more water because overall, on an average, it's at a higher elevation than the Tuolumne River above sea level, or what is causing the Merced to extract more water from its river than the Tuolumne? I mean, that's the only thing I can rationalize, that the Merced is at a higher elevation.
Sure. So it's actually going to be a combination between the absolute elevation that you're addressing, but in addition to that, our water levels in the northern half of our basin are traditionally going to be a little bit higher than what we have in the south, and that's going to be particularly driven by, if you notice here on my charts, we have the Tuolumne River is straddling the two major reservoirs, the Turlock Lake and Modesto Reservoir, and a lot of the seepage associated not only from the river itself, but the seepage we have from those reservoirs is keeping a lot of the water levels high in this area. In addition to that, the Tuolumne River, the river channel itself, the invert elevation of the channel itself is much deeper than what we have in the Merced. So it's really a combination of all these factors. The interaction as far as the what direction we're seeing a lot of the flow is really going to be driven by just the absolute water level, right? A lot of our hydraulics is based on groundwater level as compared to the water level in the river system, and there are the hydrogeological components of as I mentioned, like where are water levels high, how deep are the stream channels, the absolute elevation of the inverts of each of those rivers. But in general, I think it really comes down to the fact that in general, on our northern boundary, we have higher levels relative to the river channels comparatively to the southern half of our subbasin. And hopefully I'll be able to get into that towards the end of the presentation when we look at our groundwater level contours, and I can kind of show you how some of that works out.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So as far as the total downstream interaction, because we know that in time we're going to be pulling additional water from the river system, we need to look at how does the historical simulation and and our future conditions, how are we going to affect the downstream flows, right? Because again, as I mentioned earlier, the stream depletions is going to be a major component of SIGNA. We can't look at just our water levels in our groundwater storage. And so what we can see here when comparing to our historical period, we are effectively pulling more water out of the river. So two really charts here that I want to point out is the first third of this chart is the historical period. And so we have two combinations. We have simulated flow, and then we actually have observed flow. So you can see here that in general, the model simulates the total downstream flow, particularly calibrated to both the stream interaction and then the flow in the river, very consistently with the historical flow. And then indicative of our projection conditions, we see a lot of this is a lot of what MID is estimating as water going into the river, not MID, this is what TID is putting into the river, because this is the Tuolumne River. We can see that this volume, the volume of water going into the model that we're simulating as per the TRS simulation, is going to be consistently over time. We have We're going to have high flows due to wet hydrology. We're going to have low flows due to during drought periods and critical years. But in general, we're going to see a lot of the same fluctuation as we look at the downstream flow. Now, comparing that to how are we, where is this occurring then, right? We know that we're going to get more interaction with the stream system. How does that compare to, when's that occurring is that occurring in high flows or low flows? And really that's the design of the second chart. So this is what's called an exceedance chart. And really what this means is this is the probability of succeedance. And this tells us really how well we are replicating comparatively the historical period compared to the observation, and then our baseline comparatively to historical. And so the first component that I want to point out is our historical, which is in this orange color, compared to our observed flow. And really what we can see is that in our historical period, again, this gives us the confidence to know that our calibration of the model, that our stream interaction that we simulated in the historical version of the model is fairly accurate. It captures the high flows and it captures the low flows with a high degree of accuracy. Then the second step that we take a look at is well, how do we compare the baseline flow to the historical flow? Now, we can't really compare this to observational data because the inflows aren't the same. But if we want to look at the general trends as we compare baseline to historical, what you can see is that in general, at the very highest of flows, we are, and throughout, even I would say the majority of flows, we are not going to heavily impact the downstream flow. On the other hand, once you start getting into, we start seeing some divergence between the two comparisons when we start getting into 60, 70, 80, and particularly the 90th percentile of our low flow regimes. And what this means effectively is that our high flows, we may not be impacting the kind of downstream flows, and particularly the downstream flow requirements that the districts have. But on the other hand, if we continue to reduce our groundwater levels and induce more stream interaction, it's these low flow regimes that we will start seeing some variance in, and we will start impacting the downstream flow of both the rivers, of the Tuolumne River, but then also our downstream flow requirements as we discharge water into the San Joaquin and downstream of the subbasin as a whole.
Dominic?
Yes, sir.
This is Ali. It's 3:36. So I think we need to try to whiz through a few of these slides. Well, I don't want you to speed it up, but you may want to just, because folks also have a copy of this and we're always available to address questions. I want to leave some time for questions also. So my suggestion is go to the groundwater budgets. Let's skip these here and then come back to these other ones. Of course, Merced is affected by quite a bit as folks have seen it. So let's go to the groundwater budgets.
Okay.
And then eventually groundwater levels also, but let's move faster.
Okay.
Thank you.
So when it comes to, so then the next component of our groundwater budget that we want to be able to build is what is our subsurface flow. And so really what we can see as a basin whole, if we break down our subsurface flow into each of the different directional areas that we have, really what we can see as a subbasin in general is that the Merced subbasin over time, we're seeing very consistent flow moving from the Merced subbasin into the Turlock subbasin. That's in this pink color. On the other hand, when it comes to the Delta Mendota subbasin, we usually discharge water from our aquifer system to the Delta Mendota subbasin. And to our north, the Modesto subbasin, what we can see is that particularly historically, we have been a net receiver of Modesto subsurface flow, and we will see that really consistently for about the first half of our baseline simulation, but really towards the second half and particularly towards the very end of it, we start seeing a cone of depression occur, particularly again around the city of Modesto, at which point we get to the point where the kind of the net interaction between Turlock and Modesto, we start seeing water moving from the Turlock subbasin to the Modesto subbasin. So then if we want to take a look at the breakdown of the GSAs, we see when we look at the Western GSA, we can see that very, very consistently the same thing. A lot of our Delta Mendota interaction we see is going to be very consistent over time. The Modesto subbasin is going to be indicative of that relationship where we have The Modesto subbasin is declining a little bit faster than us, particularly around the city of Modesto, and that's going to be where the subsurface flows kind of change direction on us. And then even the Merced subbasin, we're going to see again very consistent flows of water moving from the Merced subbasin to the Turlock subbasin in the western half of our subbasin as well. Now, the one component that you will see here that is different than the previous slide is going to be the interaction between the two GSAs. This is going to be and this yellow bar is going to be the volume of water that is moving effectively from the western GSA to the eastern GSA, basically underneath ground. So this subsurface flow, this contribution is effectively that there is there's a cone of depression on the eastern side of our subbasin, and you can see water that we have water moving from the west to the east, attempting to fill to some degree that, or at least to balance that cone of depression, or at least contributing to that cone of depression. And similarly, if we looked at the inverse of that, if we look on the eastern side of the subbasin, we see that interaction. We see the east side accepting that water from the West Turlock GSA, but then very indicative also of the total interaction. We see the Merced subbasin continuing to continuation of water moving from the Merced subbasin into the Turlock subbasin. Okay, so now that we've kind of looked at the detailed breakdown of everything, let's put it all together. And so really indicative of the question I was asked earlier about the operational groundwater budgets and the component tree of what is our total overdrafts and our total decline in groundwater storage this is really the aspect of that. And so really the first step is to take a look at the operational budget, right? That straight vertical interaction between of what we're interacting with our aquifer system. And then in addition to that, we then have the stream aquifer interaction. This is this is our combination of the three major rivers. And again, similarly to as our look at kind of the detailed breakdown of this, we do see that on a net value that we go from being a net giver to the aquifer system to be a net extractor from our aquifer system. And that water levels, we're pulling water from the streams and effectively reducing their downstream flow. Then the last component that I just went over is our subsurface flow. Again, we see on a subbasin scale, we see very consistent subsurface flow from adjacent areas. In general, we are a net receiver on a subbasin scale. We're a net receiver from each of the three surrounding subbasins, and that's why we see this yellow consistently on the positive direction. That's as water coming into our system. And then finally, what we have here is the total groundwater budget. And the last component that was added to this slide is what we're considering our change in groundwater storage. And so what you're going to see here, particularly where this guy right here is pointing to, is that any of the orange bars in the positive directions are groundwater storage depletions. These are years due to hydrology, due to all the factors combined that we're seeing declines in groundwater storage, declines in water levels, and then the inverse of that being where we have where the storage is in the negative direction here. This is actually groundwater storage increase. So these are the years where water levels are increasing. And this is again due to hydrology, due to the availability of precipitation, availability of surface water, things to that effect. But overall, what you can kind of see here is that for the subbasin as a whole, is that in general, a lot of the take-home points is that as a subbasin, that we are still in general depleting our aquifer system in the baseline. The groundwater storage, the groundwater levels are going to continue to decline. In addition to that, we are at a focal point now in which our groundwater system goes from being a net extractor, our groundwater system goes from being a net giver to the stream system to being a net extractor from the stream system. That is again because our water levels have declined to the point which our streams are contributing more water, effectively trying to fill the void that is there. Now the breakdown of that is when it comes to each GSA, we can see a lot of this, a lot of the same trends that in general our groundwater storage depletion, even in the West, that water levels are going to continue to go down over time, and that our stream interaction, where not entirely becoming a net extractor from the system, but we do go from being a very heavily net giver, next discharger to the river system, we start becoming a lot more balanced by the time, particularly by the second half of our baseline. You can see here that a lot of the blue which is our stream interaction, starts showing up in both directions rather than being a heavy giver to the stream system. And then again, due to the west being having a good deal of subsurface flow moving from west to east, we start seeing a continuation of the subsurface outflow to, in this case, this is to all areas. This is a net value, but this is going to be predominantly going to the east. And we can see that continuing to grow over time due to continued over-extraction in the east. And then as we take a look at the east, total groundwater budget for the Eastern GSA, we see a lot of that flow particularly the subsurface flow that we have from adjacent areas being predominantly being water moving from the West Turlock Subbasin GSA to the east, but being also combined now with any subsurface flows from the Merced, particularly the Merced Subbasin, moving north into the east side. And effectively, so we see a lot of in order to balance this, we see a lot of subsurface flow moving from south to north and from west to east. In addition to that, this is also where we see predominantly, again, the Merced River being fairly heavily of us being an overall somewhat imbalanced river as a combination of the Merced and the Tuolumne, to over time, as we continue to extract more water from our stream system, as we continue to decline our well water levels, the stream system will continue to give more water to our baseline in order to attempt to stabilize the water levels, but at the expense, and this is kind of really key, is that the stabilization of our storage, the stabilization of our groundwaters isn't the only sustainable criteria, and that we will also have to take into account negative impacts from stream depletion. So this is another component that is going to be important for us to take a look at. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to jump on to water levels, and hopefully I'm sure we'll have a couple questions about water budgets. We'll get back to those in a second, but I only have a couple more slides, namely two, that we can take a look at some of the contours that we're simulating in the model. And so really what we have here is a combination of the fall 2014 contours. So this is towards the end of our historical period, with the 46th year of our baseline simulation, the 46th year, and that is indicative of the 2014 hydrology. So this is these two contour maps are 50 years apart from each other. They have the same hydrology from as far as precipitation, as far as stream inflows, but they are, there's 50 years of operational changes occurring between the two. So the first slide that I want to take a look at is really what we're considering the western upper aquifer. So this is the above Corcoran aquifer in the western side of the subbasin. And then when it comes to the eastern aquifer, we have one principal aquifer. And so really that's why this is going to, both this slide and the next slide, the eastern aquifer will look the exact same. But the western above the Corcoran, what we can really see here is a couple main, between the comparison of a couple of these things, is that we see really two main points. The first of which is that we see a continuation of decline in water levels, whether that is on the west, whether we can see water levels going from ranging from 30 to 60, 70, 80 acre feet, but we can see that at least in the shallow aquifer, we can see a continuation that those water levels, while declining, do not decline significantly in the shallow aquifer system. On the other hand, when we get to the completely unconfined aquifer system of the east, we see that continued over-extraction that we talked about a lot earlier. That continued extraction will induce a continued decline in water levels over time. And so that's why we can see here, even at the deepest points, we move from about zero mean sea level to at the end of this period, we're seeing about negative 30 feet below. So we're seeing that continued decline on on the east. And then in addition to that, really the other component that we really wanted to point out here as we look into this is where we can see a lot of the interaction to our aquifer, our stream aquifer interaction, our stream system. And we can start seeing that we have effectively, due to the shape of the contours, you can see particularly as we kind of get into here, this natural, effectively the angle or the pointing of the upstream is indicative of us being a giver to the stream system, and and over time, we can see a lot of those shapes that we can see a lot of that interaction changing over time. And, you know, that's even particularly more, it's a little harder to see in this yellow coloring, but we can see that same trend being occurring in the east, right? So if this is pointing upstream on the Tuolumne, we see that same idea, that pointing of downstream of a contour is indicative of the stream system giving additional water to the aquifer system. And so we can really see a lot of that interaction occurring as we look at some of the water levels across the subbasin as well. And then comparatively to the shallow western aquifer, when we look at the when we look at the western lower aquifer system, so this is sub-Corcoran on the west, this is where we see a lot of the water level decline. So we didn't, you know, we saw some, but we didn't see a lot of water level decline in the shallow aquifer, particularly in the west. But when it comes to the lower aquifer, sub-Corcoran, we start seeing a lot of declines in water levels. You can see that we go from being fairly consistent, you know, a trend of between 40 and 50 feet here, to start reaching the points where we start seeing, particularly around the cities, around the municipalities that have very focused pumping regimes. Around the cities, Ceres, Modesto, we can see a cone forming towards the end of the simulation period there. Same thing around the city of Turlock. We see a continued decline in water levels in these concentrated areas where we have a lot of groundwater production. And so in general, that's what we do see a lot of, we do see a long-term overall decline. We do see a lot of interaction in our water levels, and that's really indicative of a lot of the other components. So that's really, I wanted to really make a point to show that kind of the full picture here, because our extraction drives a lot of the flow dynamics with the water system. It drives, because we're not just looking at just the over extraction of water as our sustainability criteria. We're looking at the full big picture, and so that's why we're targeting things like subsurface flows, stream aquifer interaction, and those are very heavily driven by the water levels. And so that's why I feel like it's very important that we go to show that. The last feature that I really forgot, that because I wanted to follow up on that last question that we had earlier about the differences between the Tuolumne River and the Merced River as far as its interactions go. And that was just to also point out that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the water levels associated, we can see here that a lot of the water levels comparatively to the groundwater levels and the stream stage and stream total elevation, that's where we can see the water levels are a little bit higher when it comes to this general area. And so we see that interaction behaving a little differently from the Merced River comparatively down here to our south. So then to wrap it up real quick before we get to questions, the next steps that we're taking a look to, as I mentioned kind of at the beginning of this, we're really going to hopefully dive in the first quarter of our next upcoming 2021. A lot of our goal is to look at sustainable yield, to look at climate change, to really beginning to understand really what it's going to take to bring our basin into sustainability. And that's going to be really of our goal from a modeling perspective. I think Phyllis is going to do a lot of interaction with the GSA or the GSAs and with the subbasin as a whole to try to be able to understand what projects and management actions can we utilize to achieve sustainability. And then hopefully we'll be able to take a lot of that information, a lot of the feedback that we're receiving from each of you guys, put that in the model, engage whether or not how effective that is, and what it will take effectively for us to become a sustainable subbasin.
Thanks, Dominic. That was a fantastic presentation. That was a lot to cover, and I appreciate everybody hanging in there with us. We've got time just for a few questions. We do have a few additional items on the agenda that we want to handle before we end today, but that they will be short. So probably just a few questions here, and then we'll move along.
Phyllis, this is Milt. I do have some questions for Dominic. In some of the first graphs that you were showing, or the first pictures you were showing, you were putting a lot of emphasis on urban growth. But I would question you on that. And the reason I'll do that is because when we had our last drought, urban growth was required to cut back on their water usage, and the city of Turlock did an excellent job. We could cut our water usage back almost 50% or more.
Absolutely.
And so yes, Phyllis.
I was just going to say thanks very much, Bill. We certainly have those conservation efforts built into to our projected baseline. And we also have all of the requirements that the state is putting on the municipalities to decrease their water use average long-term by 20% by 2020. So all of that is in our projected baseline. And then finally, I'll just say that, remember, this is the projected baseline is a condition without any projects and without any actions at all. And when we get into our projects, one of the things that we're going to see is that the TID has already committed to sharing their surface water supply with Ceres and with the city of Turlock. So we're going to be able to manage that as well. Any other quick questions?
I don't know about that, Phyllis. I mean, because I'm only using 10,000 gallons here in my household. There are some people in Turlock who use 80,000 gallons. We can fallow our lawns, and that's what will happen. We will not be able to grow lawns. They will just make them go dead. Okay, that's my last answer, my last comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milt. Any other questions from anyone before we end this? Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much, Dominic and Ali, for putting together so much dense information and going through all of it so briskly. But I think also at a pace where we were able to generally follow what was happening. So thanks so much for that. And Michael, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Phyllis, and thank you, Dominic, for your hard work there for going through it quickly. The kind of, as Phyllis mentioned, that's kind of I guess you could say the worst case scenario. If we do nothing over the next number of years, this is what the basin could look like. And Herb, you've made the slides available on the website, so people get those, look at those, understand those, and then next steps, as Dominic mentioned, is developing the sustainable yield and other things. And from there, we'll develop projects and programs to hopefully address some of the potential challenges we have ahead down the road. So again, thanks for everybody for the participation. Okay, moving on to number 9, Sigma related updates. This is a chance for TAC members to update us all on things that are going on. These are non-action items. So first we have the public outreach update. Herb, can you give us something there?
Yeah, I have a couple quick items, Michael. The first thing is tomorrow, and you guys have seen this if you're on our distribution lists and following us on social media. The first thing is tomorrow from 12:30 to 1:30, we're going to have our second groundwater lunch hour. The ad hoc communications group will be hosting that and answering questions from stakeholders. We have no real agenda. We're just there as a resource to answer questions, and we can go over slides that have been presented the past month since our last workshop or since our last lunch hour. And so we're going to do that. That's tomorrow at 12:30. Information is available on the website, front and center, for how to, I'm not going to say register. There's no registration. You just need to kind of find the URL and the link, and you can click in there and visit for 5 minutes or visit for the whole hour if stakeholders like. So just putting that out there. And then 3 other items, which you'll hear a lot more from us and me in future meetings, but I'll just briefly touch on them now informationally. The first is that we have, I think it was brought before at least the West Turlock Subbasin GSA board about a year or so ago. We've been in contact with 2 groups, EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, and RCAC, the Rural Counties Assistance Corporation, who are putting together a groundwater leadership institute in the Turlock Subbasin. And their thoughts are, they've done this successfully in 2 other places up and down the state in past years, and they're gonna get a cohort of somewhere between 10 to 20 participants that live within the Turlock Subbasin and go through they're looking around a 15-week training virtually, where they're going to present content, talk a little bit about how to get involved, and how to be, basically it's kind of like a citizens academy for those cities who've done it before. And we're going to have some input into discussing what they talk about and what the content will be. And they're also getting ready to start looking toward a recruitment committee to get these 10 to 20 people interested. They're looking to try and get people from all different water user types within the subbasin and all different diversities and backgrounds. And so they're going to start a recruitment committee soon too. And so I'll present more and more information on that as it comes up. But we've mentioned before in the past that Leadership Institute is a really good thing for us as a sub-basin in order to make contacts and make relationships with those who are in the group, so that we can find ways to get our Sigma outreach related to the GSP out. They're looking at starting this up possibly virtually in spring of next year, which lines up perfectly with our GSP coming out with a draft, and then toward the end of the year having a final version. So we're going to try and piggyback on that and get some outreach. So that's an update on that, and you'll hear more about that in the future. And then also we are working on the Ad Hoc Communications Committee is working on a second video. This one will most likely be a little bit shorter. We did a 5-minute Sigma 101 video this time last year, I want to say. Working on a second video. The topic will be water budgets, and we'll try and stay as high level as we can. Definitely not to the level you heard today from Dominic. And we'll cover that and use that as an informational and outreach and educational material. And so the goal would be to have that up and running sometime around March, and we're working with the vendor on that. And then the last thing is with the GSP starting to, it's been being developed, and eventually in mid next year or so, there'll be a draft out. We're going to try and start putting together a GSP specific page on the website. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, please send them my way. But I'm kind of putting together some thoughts in my head, and I'll talk with our ad hoc group when we have our every other week calls and figure out how we're going to do that, because it's about time to start having GSP specific information on a specific page of the site. So that's it from me. Happy to answer any questions or lead to the grant update for Debbie or Michael.
Thank you, Herb. Doesn't sound like there's any questions. Don't forget to drop in tomorrow, and encourage people to take advantage of that. It's a great opportunity. I think the volunteers from the 2 GSAs for doing that. It's a great service. Okay, Debbie, do you have something on the grant update?
Sorry, I was on mute. Can you hear me now?
Can.
So just a quick update. So for the round 3 grant, we are installing some wells for part of that grant, and we are also developing the groundwater recharge assessment tool. So I wanted to give updates on each of those. The grant agreement, or the access agreement for the well installation. We do have a draft. I think it has been circulated back and forth between the West and the East GSA. I think we may have made some adjustments to it and sent it back to the East Turlock GSA Council, if I recall correctly. Valerie, could you maybe weigh in on that? Ultimately, I think scheduling perspective, we're trying to finalize locations and then move towards will design and then a bidding process early next year. And so, so we'll need to have that completed and then signed and all of that in that time frame as well. So Valerie, sorry.
Yep, sorry. That's right. So we went back and forth, and we had an access agreement, and then I think we rethought how much access and signatory authority DWR need to have. So we sent that back to the East, and Lauren Lane reviewed it, and if I recall correctly, she said that was fine. She didn't mind the changes. So I think from the council's perspective, I believe we're at a place where we're both comfortable moving it forward. So I think we had a couple issues that we have to figure out of whether we need to record those access agreements and exactly what that means. But I think that's the update from my perspective, is that I've shared it with Lauren, and her response to me was that it was none of the changes we made caused her any issues. So.
Thank you, Valerie. So Kevin, I wanted to reach out to you maybe later this week to talk logistically about surveying and access agreements and recording and those types of things on the east, wells and what your plan might be with respect to some of that. And so I will reach out to you on that so we can kind of move that forward.
Sounds great, Debbie.
Thank you. Then with respect to the GRAT agreement and the GRAT development, the planning team for that has been meeting on a regular basis. We meet on Monday mornings at 9 o'clock, bright and early. And we've been kind of walking through how the GRAT works and how to kind of incorporate it and the information for the Turlock Subbasin, and I think that's moving forward. We also have 2 agreements for that process. One is a license agreement that will need to be taken to the West Turlock Subbasin GSA for approval, and that kind of lays out the licensing for the use of the GRAT tool, and Valerie could talk a little bit about that. And then there's a non-disclosure agreement that's been circulated as well. And so Valerie, maybe you could kind of give an update on those.
Sure. So the GRAT license agreement is between the grantee, which is West Turlock. And so West Turlock's board will have to execute that license agreement. And from a pretty high level perspective, it means that we won't kind of take the IP, the intellectual property component, or take the deliverable of the GRAT and kind of resell it or use it in a different way. And it does allow for the West Turlock to identify authorized users, which I think is helpful. And I'm hopeful that that will allow us to license the GRAT tool by signing it from the West Turlock, but also allow to, other users and other members of both the West and East Turlock GSAs to use the tool as we need to and as we see fit for the basin. So as Debbie said, we went back and forth with the sustainable conservation folks, and I think we have a final on that. It will go for execution, I think, at the next West Turlock GSA board meeting. If anyone wants to see it, I'm more than happy to distribute it and show folks. But again, the next steps for folks who want access to that will just be that we have to kind of identify authorized users and go from there. The non-disclosure agreement is a little bit more broad, and it's basically an agreement between the GSAs and any members that want to sign off. If any members are providing data that you kind of just want to make sure that as we give them to consultants, the consultants don't disclose, and make sure that the disclosure to the consultants is not a third-party disclosure for any Public Record Act purpose, you can sign on to that. We distributed previously, and I know that the West Turlock approved the NDA in draft form. My understanding is that most of the consultants on the GRAT and Todd and those folks have reviewed it and don't have any issues with it and aren't suggesting any changes. So Debbie, did we say if members want to sign on, do we say December 22nd would be an appropriate deadline to say, yes, put us on a signature block for the NDA, or no, we don't need to be covered by it. But at that point, we'd like to put either a signature block on for a member or a GSA and get it circulated and final so we can get it signed. So all the data that we're providing to run these programs is at least protected at that kind of consultant level. So
yes, if we could get, oh, sorry, go ahead, Valerie.
Sorry.
So if we could get an indication if your agency or anyone on on the eastern side, whether it be the GSA or individual agencies that might be providing data for this process, if you're interested in signing on as well, if you could let us know by the 22nd, then we could begin circulating that and move that forward, and then begin providing the information necessary to develop the grad, and we can move that process along. There had been discussions about what information is available, and so the agencies are kind of putting that together, but I don't think a lot of the information has been provided yet to the grad team until we go through this process.
Hey, Debbie, can I make a suggestion? Maybe you email
Please.
the group and give a deadline. Say, if you want to be part of the NDA, let us know by this day. If we don't hear from you, we'll leave you off the signature block. I think it's a way to create a deadline and get it finalized.
I believe that was circulated earlier this week, but I can send another.
Well, there you go. I appreciate. See, you're 3 steps ahead of me, or I'm not paying attention. Probably both. But thank you. And again, everybody, if you want to be on the NDA, let Debbie know. If not, we'll assume it's not an issue for your agency. Okay, so that brings us to item 10, next meeting, which is Thursday, January 28th. But the consultant team has reminded me, as you heard today, we are, we've done the baseline model. We'll be doing the sustainable yield, and we have to have a plan done by the middle or fall of next year. So we have a lot of work to do next year. And with that, I'd like you to just pencil in your diaries for January, February, March of next year, extra meetings for the TAC. So we supposedly meet once a month, but I think next January, February, March, just plan potentially of meeting twice a month. Pencil it in your diaries anyway. So that'll be the second Thursday of the month. So January, that'll be January 14th. February 11th, and then March 11th. Again, we don't know if we'll use those meetings for sure, but I know a lot of you, like me, are putting your calendar together for next year. It might be worth penciling those in if you can. Okay. So with that, our next meeting right now is January 28th. Wish you all happy holidays and happy New Year. Let's hope 2021 is better than 2020. Apart from Debbie getting married, obviously, that was good for her. So, and stay safe, stay distanced. And with that, I ask for a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Curtis, we have a second on the west side. Leah seconded. Well, she lit up anyway. So I'm saying Leah seconded that. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, west side is adjourned. Kevin?
Thank you, Michael. Dennis, will you make a motion to adjourn the east side, please? Okay, we're adjourned at 4:11 p.m.